So how much is enough? When will this war in the Middle East end? Should Israel just say that we've done enough and it's time to move on to end this war? Take a look at what Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu had to say when he was asked this question by a CNN correspondent.
More than 40,000 Palestinians have now been killed in Gaza, a majority of whom are civilians. And these numbers are from the Palestinian Ministry of Health, but they are backed up by the United States, by international organizations. Humanitarian conditions in Gaza have degraded so much that diseases like polio and hepatitis A are now spreading. We have seen countless children be orphaned. We have seen countless mothers lose their children. How much is too much, sir? At what point is it time to end this war?
Well, we'll end the war when we achieve our war goals of making sure that Hamas can't repeat such atrocities. But we're fighting this war in a just war with just means. In fact, with means that no other army has ever fought. No other army has taken the precautions that Israel has taken, sometimes at great risk, to make sure that we minimize the number of casualties. You talked about polio. We enabled now massive vaccination of polio. We want 90% of the Gazan people of Gaza vaccinated. I think 200,000 I think were vaccinated today. We put in 1 million tons of food, 1 million tons of aid, 700,000 tons of food. That's unheard of. We've taken, because we think that every civilian death is a tragedy. For Hamas, every civilian death is a strategy. For us, it's a tragedy. There are 1.4 million people in Gaza. They moved from the north to the south. You're going to have thousands, 20,000 killed. You're going to have a catastrophe, a humanitarian catastrophe. They had no place to go, no food to eat. Now report honestly, because here's what happened. They all left. They went to the humanitarian zone, which is 2 miles away, less, on the beach. They have tents. We supplied tents for 150,000 people. The aid agencies supplied the rest, and some of them carried their own tents. They have a place. We supplied water lines, sewage lines, food. There's more to be done, medical. So now we know how many people were killed, how many terrorists, because we counted them. And we just passed 2,000. Terrorists, body counts of terrorists. The people left. How many civilians died? I asked the commander of the division that did the Rafah operation and the Philadelphia corridor. He said, Prime Minister, there are hardly any civilian deaths because everybody left. They heeded our warnings. But he said there were probably 24, and most of them occurred, 24, and most of them occurred when one of our bombs hit a Hamas ammunition depot that was planted inside a residential area. 40 people died, about 20 were terrorists, but 20 were civilians. And he said that's most of the deaths. That's the lowest ratio of non-combatants to combatants in the history of urban warfare. That's it. Now report honestly, because you accused us of something that is outrageous. And in fact, the accusations against us are outrageously false. Humanitarian aid? 1 million trucks of aid, 1 million tons of aid? 700,000 tons of food? A deliberate starvation policy? You can say anything. Doesn't make it true. You repeat a lie over and over and over again. It assumes the cachet of self-evident truth, but it's false. Israel is doing, and the Israeli army is doing, something that no other army has done in history and will continue to do that. I'm not going to change my policies. Humanitarian policies, vaccination policies, combat policies to minimize civilian casualties.
You know, if your house is on fire, you can't just say, I'm going to put out 65% or 85% of the fire, and then that's enough. No, you got to put out the entire fire in order to make sure that your family and you are safe and you're not in any further danger. It's interesting that World War I did not end with a peace treaty. just with an armistice or a truce between the Allies and the German government. And that's why it led to World War II. At the end of World War II, the Allies agreed that they needed to march through Berlin, even if the Germans would concede defeat, because it was that critical and important to make sure that victory was done so thoroughly to ensure that the Germans would never, ever again be a threat. Israel's got to do what Israel's got to do until she brings every one of her last hostages home, and until Israel ensures that Hamas will never, ever, ever again be able to do what they've done. And what you're hearing in the media, it's a total Baba Maisa. They say that if you haven't heard the news, if you haven't read the news, you're uninformed. And if you have read the news, then you're misinformed. It seems very clear that Israel is fighting a war not only against her enemies in every direction, but there's actually a propaganda war coming from the media and from various leadership of the various countries around the world that are trying to vilify Israel and condemn Israel with presupposition and prejudice, which is not factually true. And what's happening is that Israel's fighting a war right now, which is creating an impossible standard for other nations to fight. Can you imagine that Russia the other day condemned Israel for invading Syria? It's like almost like you can't make this stuff up. Russia, that has invaded Ukraine, is criticizing Israel for invading Syria. You can't even make this stuff up. And the United Nations on December 27th, the Secretary General of the United Nations, decided on December 27th, just the other day, to condemn Israel for firing rockets, missiles at the Houthis in Yemen. So there's a dangerous pattern emerging here. When Hamas fires rockets, when Hezbollah fires rockets for an entire year, Hamas is firing rockets since the day that Israel evacuated, moved out of the Gaza Strip, effectively rendering it unoccupied according to all opinions. For 18 years, since 2005, Israel's been receiving rockets from Hamas in Gaza. No condemnation from the United Nations. Same thing from Hezbollah in the north. Same thing, no condemnation on the Houthi rockets in Israel. It's only when Israel retaliates against Hamas in Gaza, against Hezbollah in Lebanon, against the Houthis in Yemen, that's when the United Nations decides to condemn Israel. It's almost laughable. Rockets are coming in from Iraq. Rockets are coming in from Iran. No condemnation of those countries. Only when Israel chooses to defend herself. Now, the United Nations decides to condemn Israel. The United Nations has a problem, which is an inability to admit that Israel's actually fighting for her life and doing the right thing. Take a look at what this United Nations representative had to say when asked to call a spade, when she was asked to identify who it is that's siphoning off the aid that's being sent to Gaza. Take a look at this.
Okay. Secondly, in terms of Jenin, the UNRWA had put out a statement that there were Palestinian armed actors that had infiltrated there and taken control. Obviously, it's an ongoing situation. Who are these Palestinian armed actors? Can the UN actually name them?
I would have to get back to you on that, Mike.
Okay, and last question for you. So that statement from UNRWA on those Palestinian armed actors, it took 4 days for them to release that statement acknowledging that the Jenin community camp, whatever it's called, had been taken control of by these armed actors, terrorists, what have you. Israeli incursions into UNRWA facilities are usually reported on in about 30 seconds. Is there some specific reason UNRWA waited 4 days to acknowledge that one of its camps had been taken over by armed actors?
I'll refer you to UNRWA on that, Mike.
Unbelievable. The world's oldest hatred has just, we thought that anti-Semitism maybe had calmed down since World War II, since the Holocaust. But oh no, October 7th has reminded us that it is alive and well in the highest echelons of government and world power and influence. Let's not allow ourselves to drink the Kool-Aid. Let's not allow ourselves to become the victims of this new front of the war, a less a less militant part of the war, but no less toxic. This is the angle of the war coming from the media, coming from the United Nations. Let's listen to what Bibi had to say. Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, there's almost the civilian deaths are so minimal, and they are truly collateral damage from terrorists that are embedded inside of civilian areas. Let us celebrate Israel as the army, as the country, which is the most humanitarian, the most a light unto the nations, like no other army in the history of the world has ever been able to achieve. And time will only tell how future wars of other nations, if they'll even get close to being able to stand at the humanitarian and the kind and the menschlichkeit, which is the Israeli army.